Well, welcome, folks. It's good to see everybody here. And we had a bit of a chat just at the beginning. And just to say, if you're having trouble getting the recording for previous sections, they may still be backing up. They may not yet be available. They will all be available eventually. But I know there was a backlog waiting to be uploaded of a whole variety of things, which includes this course. So if you have had difficulty getting it, go back and check again, because it may be that it's one of the ones that's been held up. But I think if people are having real difficulty, if you let us know, we might be able to send you a direct link when it does go up. I think that's the only admin-y thing I have to say today, unless, Kate, you know of anything else, but I didn't have anything else, I think.
Everything's fine, thank you.
Thank you, that's great. So over the last few weeks, we have been concentrating on the first 5 centuries, on the kind of what we know as the early church, patristic period. The next few weeks, we're going to concentrate on roughly 1,000 years, and what we call really what's covered by the term medieval. And today, we're going to look very briefly and quite, I hope, without too much confusing detail, at how we get from one to the other. How do we move from a small persecuted minority? I mean, remember the story of some of the persecutions that we heard, from that to the only option in town if you're living in Europe, and what we refer to as Christendom. So the all-inclusive nature, we'll look in more detail in the next few weeks at what Christendom means, but Christendom is the all-inclusive nature. If you are in this community, you are Christian. That is just goes without saying, unless you are Jewish and therefore the small persecuted minority. And the answer starts with Constantine. There we go. That's the statue of Constantine at York. He was born in Britain. And we talked a little bit about Constantine. Constantine in 312 wins the Battle of Milvian Bridge. And you can just see, the picture doesn't give it all, but by this sign, it goes on to say conquer. If you remember, there was the vision or the dream just before the battle, which drew him towards honouring the Christian God as opposed to the Roman gods who had been the dominant religion. And what Constantine does is stop the persecution, allow the church to exist, and then in some ways goes on to favour the church, but alongside continuing paganism. So as far as Constantine is concerned, although he is giving the church some special treatment, he is also allowing a relative freedom of religion, and other religion is also continuing beside him. We move on a little later, and there's several people in between, but the next person who has an impact on the church, Theodosius I, who was emperor between 347 and 395. Michael Grant, one of the historians, says he earned the title of the Great because of his devout Christianity. Others might question just how devout, but one of the things that Theodosius does is draw up a law code known as the Theodosian Code. And within that, it is clear that there is decreasing toleration for pagans and for Jews and for Christian schismatics or heretics, that is, those who split the church or those who do not align themselves with the dominant theology. So the schismatics are those who set up a separate church. The heretics are those who are kind of hovering around the edge. And the decreasing toleration is marked by the introduction through the Theodosian Code of punishments for those who come into these categories of pagans, Jews, or schismatic and heretics. So what we're getting with this code, the move from Constantine to Theodosius, or from just pre-Constantine really, is the move from being a persecuted community actually to being a persecuting community. There is a structure emerging within the church as supported by the empire that is actually making it a persecuting community, persecuting those who are believing something different, Jews and pagans, and persecuting those who don't agree with the dominant theology, the heretics and the schismatics. Justinian is the last of the emperors we need to know about at the moment. In 520, Justinian is several generations down the line, but in 529 he starts what becomes known as the Justinian Code, and what he's doing is actually and literally codifying the laws going right back to Hadrian. He's trying to bring together and to systematize Roman law that has, as far as he's concerned, been shooting off in all sorts of directions. So he draws up this whole code of laws and tries to bring them into some kind of systematic order. And as part of this, he also introduces several religious restrictions and definitions of how to live, and it is now compulsory to be Christian. What happens under Justinian is that being Roman, being part of the Roman Empire, and being Christian are now coterminous. If you are going to be a Roman citizen, you are going to be a Christian. With the possible exception of Anglo-Saxon England, Justinian is emperor at the time when that we refer to within English history as the Anglo-Saxon period, and that has not yet been we're still because England, Anglo-Saxon England, is right on the borders, and the Roman rule has really been withdrawn in the mid 400s from England, although there's still a sense of a Roman presence and still looking towards Rome for protection and identity, but the church hasn't taken such deep roots. But within continental Europe, that part of the empire, to be Roman and to be Christian have now become identified. Now, how does this happen? How do we move from Constantine's toleration to Justinian's absolute, if you are one, you are the other? Well, partly it's a deliberate mission policy, and particularly identifying leaders of communities, kings or warlords or those who were in charge of large communities, and converting them, and then their people would follow. And it was a very clear people movement. If you get the leaders, then the tribes and the communities will become Christian. So it's a very top-down model of mission. There's also osmosis. There's intermarriage. There's Christian people are marrying into communities that are dominantly Christian and are becoming Christian. And there's education going on, and people are being we'll talk next week a bit more, or next time a bit more about monasticism, but the growth of monastic movements beginning to be centers of teaching, even at this stage. People are being trained to read, to write, and being taught to be Christian at the same time. There's a kind of permeation through society, through education of the faith, and it's beginning to spread out. Also within this time, we have the sack of Rome by the Visigoths. We have the collapse and the disintegration of the infrastructure of the Western Empire. Sorry, that's just to show I knew I missed a screen. Let me just go back a bit. You can see here that the colors will show you the speed with which Christianity is following. So the darker oranges are those areas where Christianity was dominant by 325. So by the time of the Nicene Council. By 600, by the time we get just to the Justinian Code is beginning to be enacted, if you like, that's how far the faith has spread. Areas that are now dominantly Christian. And I say it's by direct mission policy and by osmosis, by education. And also within this period, fall of Rome, collapse of the Western Empire, and the capital really of the empire is in this map called Byzantium, Constantinople. The two names are used of the city. Byzantium was the name of the city before Constantine came and did his big thing and rebuilt it and called it Constantinople. But you will find it referred to as Byzantium as well. And by 600, the capital of the Roman Empire is now located in Constantinople. And really, the Roman Empire is still surviving as a viable entity in the eastern part, where the western part has begun to break down because there's been the Goths, the Visigoths, the Vandals, the Huns, if you've read 1066 and all that. But there's been the great people movement through. Rome was sacked in 410. There's all sorts of just the collapse of the infrastructure and the withdrawal of the legions from Britain and from the borderlands. So the Western Empire has become, well, really a series of adjacent but quite separate communities dominated by different tribal groups. Whereas the Eastern Empire has a much more coherent sense of its identity and has continuing centres of Christian leadership, actually, in Constantinople and in Alexandria, this part here. And if you remember when we were talking about the councils, do you remember that the councils were all called by the emperors? And this is the emperor based by now, after Constantine, the emperors are almost all based in Constantinople. The emperors are very much in charge of the organizing of the church, not just structurally, but also theologically, as we saw with the councils. And they're taking a real active role. And that applies in the Eastern Church. The Western Church really doesn't have the equivalent power structure. The emperor's writ, although this is still being called the Roman Empire, the emperor really doesn't have much power here. And so as political control and power has collapsed, what happens is that the power of the Bishop of Rome begins to grow because there is an infrastructure and a power structure there to sustain it. And remember Leo? Remember we heard about Leo's tome that was so influential at Chalcedon. Leo served as Pope for 20 years. And he was one of the ones who, or he's the first really, to claim the descent from Peter as the basis of the authority of the Bishop of Rome. Chalcedon had certainly affirmed Leo's tome, Chalcedon the Council in 381, and they were very happy that Leo had found them a theology and a language that helped to solve the problem that was underlying the calling of that council. So how do we talk about the two natures of Christ? How do we talk about both divinity and humanity without being only divine or only human, or one absorbing the other to such an extent that it was meaningless? So Leo had provided that, and the Eastern bishops were happy to affirm that, happy to welcome that. What they also did at the Council of Constantinople was affirm Constantinople, the city, as the new or the second Rome, because the recognition was that that's where the centre of authority was now. It's where life was happening, really. It was that barbarous West, everything was falling apart. But what they said was the place of Constantinople as leading the church, which was what they were arguing, is based on it being an imperial city. It's because it is the city of the emperor. And this was what Leo wanted to reject, because of course he couldn't claim that any longer about Rome. Therefore, he couldn't claim a similar authority for Rome because there wasn't an emperor there. And what Leo claimed was that Rome was the city, or the church in Rome was the place where authority rested because Peter had been bishop there. And this is the first time, so the 380s is the first time we get that claim that the authority of the Bishop of Rome rests on succession of Peter. the Constantinople, the Eastern Church, Constantinople, Alexandria, and so they were not terribly thrilled about that, and so they rejected his claim. And again, you've got a split going on. It's this ever deepening split between East and West, between Latin and Greek, and between, well, one of the focuses, of course, for the split is what is the role of the emperor. Leo objected to the emperor's involvement in the church in the way that the Constantinople Council was trying to affirm it, because he was arguing that this led to a blurring of the boundaries between church and political power, and that this was this compromised the church. This brought the church. It put another authority over the church other than God, and therefore compromised it and diminished its power and its identity. And there was a continuing debate over the Chalcedonian definition, and there were those who didn't agree with it. And in the emperor between 491 and 518, the Emperor Anastasius, took sides. And as far as the Roman bishops were concerned, he took the wrong side. He objected to the Chalcedonian definition and wanted to go down actually a much more Arian route. And as far as the Roman bishop was concerned, this just demonstrated why you shouldn't let bishops get involved, because they weren't theologians and they got it wrong. And this would damage the church because it would get their theology wrong. Bishop of Rome at this point was called Pope Gelasius. We're just beginning to get the term Pope being used at this point. And he wrote various things, but one of the things he wrote was a document which outlined the limits of the emperor's authority. And he argued for there being two realms of power, that there was that all power came from God, and that God gave certain power to the church and certain power to the emperor, and that the church trumped the emperor when it came to theology, but by implication, actually, as it turned out. We'll hear a little various other things as well. And really what Pope Gelasius wrote shapes for the western part of Europe. There we are. I thought I got a picture of him. The western part of Europe, the relationship between church and state, church and emperor, for most of the medieval period. The Constantinople folk rejected it. And so you get a very different relationship between emperor and church in the Eastern Empire, the eastern part of the empire. It's not exactly church-state as we would understand it. It's more to do with realms of Christian authority and who has the right to exert God's authority in this area and in this area. We'll come back to this again when we come to Luther, and we hear echoes of what Augustine has been saying. And it's a debate that goes on, and it's, in a sense, it's at the very heart of what does Christendom mean. You know, while the church is a small, marginalized group, it's fine. We don't have to deal with this kind of question because we don't have the power. So we don't have to worry about how does power fit together with gospel. But as soon as you get to the point where the church is the dominant community, which is what we're talking about here, then all these issues begin to come up. And where do you look for the answers, and the debate goes on, and it's solved in different ways because there are lots of different permutations that are possible. So the emperor didn't agree. The emperor based in Constantinople didn't agree with Gelasius, and so the debate rumbles on, and there are different positions, I say, in different parts. Gelasius is succeeded by Gregory, known as Gregory the Great. Gregory really bridges the ancient and the medieval world. He came from the elite within Rome. He was very educated, but he is serving in what is effectively the disintegrating empire. And he's also Pope at the time when Islam is beginning to rise and become, as far as the church is concerned, is beginning to be experienced as a threat. Italy at this point, here we go. Italy is not one country. It is occupied by a whole variety of tribes, most of whom are Arian. They are Christian, but they're Arian rather than Nicene. And this is one of the issues that Gregory has to deal with. And the Bishop of Rome has to take responsibility for defending. You've got your city in here. Nobody else is going to defend the city of Rome against the encroaching tribes, because the emperor is way off over here somewhere, Constantinople. Over here. So he's not interested in Rome actually any longer. So if anybody's going to defend Rome, which still has this numinous sort of psychic power, people are still looking to Rome and to talking about the Roman Empire. It still has this place in people's imaginations, but it doesn't have the capacity to defend itself and to defend the rest of the empire, frankly. The only person who's got the power to do that is the Pope, because things have just developed in such a way that he has filled the power vacuum, and those in the church, those in church positions, those with education. There were those who could read and write and therefore keep the records. There were those who could deal with the courts, and this becomes more and more important under Gregory. Gregory begins to build up the organizing of a legal system which is administered through the church courts, and begins to restore order to what has been quite a chaotic set of, well, not just set of areas, but just, who's in charge and how do they relate and how's it all going to work. Constantine had given the church the right to own property. By the time we're getting to Gregory, well, actually, the time we're getting into the 6th century, the church has become a major landowner, because what happened, particularly as Rome declined, is that some of the leading families just sort of came to an end. They dissipated, and they no longer were there to hold their estates and to own their estates, and the estates came to the church. And so you begin to get, you can see round about Rome, the yellow colour, you begin to get what become the papal states. And actually the Pope begins to be a prince, a landowner, and a ruler over quite a large area. And therefore, along with that, begins to gain quite a lot of political, to have a basis for the political power that had begun to emerge as the city infrastructure disintegrated, and the Pope was taking it over. Gregory was also a missionary, or had very he didn't travel. He sent missionaries. He's the one who sent Augustine to England, to not Augustine of Hippo, okay, just Augustine of Canterbury. I meant to tell you about Gelasius. Gelasius is the one who decreed that Valentine's Day should be on the 14th of February. He was very taken with Valentine as not as the patron saint of hearts, flowers, and chocolates as we now know him, but the man who rescued women who didn't have dowries and enabled them to get married. And he wanted to support him. Anyway, yes, Gregory, the story goes that he saw the slaves in the marketplace in Rome, beautiful fair-haired boys, and said, "Who are they?" and was told they were Angles, and not Angles but angels, and sent the missionaries to Anglo-Saxon England. There were already churches in other parts of England, the Celtic missionaries, and in fact there had been churches when the Romans were present. So it wasn't a completely untouched area, but under Gregory you get the beginning of the Roman presence in England, well, in Britain, and of course that in itself leads to tensions, because the Celtic Church coming out in from the west, and eventually the Synod of Whitby, and there having to be a decision about what's going to do. We'll cover that in a couple of sessions' time. But that's one of Gregory's things, and he's also, as I say, he was building up this body of canon law, which becomes a basis for helping society to survive and is administered through the church courts, which start off based around Rome, but it begins to work, and so it begins to spread, especially as some of these areas begin to become less Arian and more Roman, more Nicene in their faith. And we're going to come on to talk about Clovis. One of the biggest tribes, one of the most successful tribes that took over so came in and then gradually spread, were the Franks. And they gradually came in, they moved their way, well, there's my cursor, moved their way in and then gradually began to take over the area. That dark red there is the sort of, not quite the largest, it does get slightly bigger, but that's the sort of very dominant area of that the Franks eventually take over. They start off as a small group and they just are very successful in battle, and also in intermarrying, and they come to dominate most of the Western European continent. In 476, the last Western emperor, so there had been the emperor, the main emperor, as it were, was based in Constantinople, but there was often what was a sort of secondary emperor, not always, but somebody whom he deputed to be based in Rome to kind of look after that bit of the empire. Always a less powerful, always under the control of the emperor in Constantinople, but just to try and hold things together. In 476, a man called Romulus Augustus, I mean, it was a really powerful name. He was clearly trying to identify himself with the whole Roman history. He was deposed by the Franks from being emperor in Rome, and really you've got then, that's just the end of Rome as the center of the empire, or is it? But it felt like it at the time. The Franks carry on, they're fighting the Romans, but gradually what happens is they begin to adopt Roman ways. Culture and language and literature and architecture. And in 481, Clovis, who is the king at that point, has a major expansion and takes in what we see here, what is now France. Now, he was recognized by the emperor in Constantinople really as being, okay, let's stop fighting this guy. Let's co-opt him. And he was named by the emperor as honorary consul. Now, this is, on one level, it meant absolutely nothing, because frankly, Clovis was king of the Franks. He had all the power he wanted. But by naming him honorary consul, what happens with that is he's adopted, as it were, into the Roman system. It was a pre-existing term that had been used in Rome when Rome itself was flourishing as the center of the empire. And if you like, it's this recognition that Rome still holds this imaginative power, and the whole idea of a Roman Empire still holds people's, it's still there in the back of people's minds as something that is not to be lost. So Clovis is named as honorary consul. So he's assimilated in. Now, Clovis was brought up Arian, but under his wife's influence, he became Nicene. And this happened, and it's very similar to Constantine. He was facing a battle. His wife had their child baptized in the Nicene faith, and he was very angry about it. And she said, you should, try it and see. Pray to God the way I pray to God and see what happens. He did, and he won the battle. And so he, just as Constantine did, said, right, that's, I will now follow this God in this way. And not only me, but my 3,000 soldiers too. And this is a very typical sort of, get the leader and everybody will follow, because of the nature of what it meant to belong to a community at this stage. So in Christmas 508, he was baptized, and this is an ivory carving of representing his his baptism. These you will understand, all the pictures I'm showing you, they're not contemporary. They're just to give you images as we talk our way through it. Now, this is as much a political conversion as a religious conversion. Remember Constantine. This worked politically. I want this God on my side, rather than the kind of thing we read with Augustine, if you like, the sort of deep, heartfelt struggle and emotional and ethical change. This is a much more Roman, if you like, kind of religion. It's which God is going to help me win battles. And it turns out that it's his wife's God, and so he submits to it. And therefore it is enforced on people. You can do that if you've got that kind of religion. It's enforced on people, and that's what Clovis did. Those whom he conquered were then to become Christian. And his intention was to build a Christian community. He was very clear about that. He was going to build a Christian nation. And other people, other tribal groups followed his very powerful and fairly violent lead, because he decided he was enforcing this at the point of a sword. Now, rule passed down through Clovis's line. If you know anything about, it used to be called the Dark Ages, it's now called late antiquity or early medieval. You may have come across the Merovingian kings. That's Clovis's line. That's what we're talking about here. It's typical Game of Thrones kind of story. There are lots of divisions. There are families falling out. There are splits and all this of it. But there's always a successor. Maybe disputed, but there's a succession. And because of the divisions and the family splits and where does power belong, what actually happens is the royal power, the Merovingian power, becomes weakened, and what were called the mayors of the palace grow in power. Now, these were sort of civil servants. If you're a Lord of the Rings fan, okay, you're going to discover a lot more about me here. Do you remember this? If you're a Lord of the Rings fan, you may remember the Steward of Gondor, who kind of held royal power while the kings were not around or had disappeared. Something similar to that. The Merovingian kings eventually become known as the do-nothing kings, some of them, because they're really kind of, well, partly it's interbreeding, and partly it's just the families have become so split, we don't actually know who's in power, and they're spending so much time fighting each other, they're not actually doing the ruling stuff. And so the mayor of the palace becomes a very powerful figure. And by 687, the mayor of the palace, who is called Pepin, although he is this civil servant, is effectively ruling this large area. And he also has the strength and the political strength, the political backing to will his position to his son. He's effectively acting as a king. He's passing on his position as mayor of the palace to his son, a man called Charles Martel. Excuse me. Now, Charles Martel led his Frankish army against the Moors. Now, that's the Islamic army in 732, and won down in this region. And in 751, as a result of that, in 751, he became king of the Franks with papal blessing. Okay, so what you've got happening here is because he'd won and he protected Christian culture and identity against this other religion that was encroaching on it, the Pope blesses him in a coup because he takes over royal power from the Merovingian do-nothing kings. He is succeeded by his son Pepin the Short, who may have been not very tall, or may have there may have been other reasons for him being called short. It may have been for the length of his reign. We're not quite clear. But Pepin the Short had two sons, one called Charlemagne and one called Charles, and they succeeded him jointly when he died in 768. Now, Charlemagne and Charles did not get on with one another, and therefore we're getting back into this are we going to end up with a split area and things falling apart? But in fact, Charlemagne died, as far as we know, from natural causes in 771, and Charles became the sole king. And we know Charles probably better as Charlemagne. And here you have the Frankish king who rules this huge area. And in 800, on Christmas Day, he was crowned by the Pope as emperor. Now, that title, emperor, hadn't been used since we lost Romulus Augustus, was only used of the emperor in Constantinople. So that's a huge political statement. And he is being crowned by the Pope. The Pope has been given or taken, and it's you know, it is made to look spontaneous. Charlemagne turns up to worship on Christmas Day, and the Pope leaps up and says, I'm going to crown you emperor. Now, it almost certainly wasn't spontaneous. It was almost certainly orchestrated by Charlemagne behind the scenes. But what the symbolism is, the Pope has the right to crown the emperor. And that means this is not just a Roman empire, this is a Holy Roman Empire. That's a term you will hear right through until the early modern period. That's still in operation when we get to the Reformation. And here you've got, if you like, the solidifying of a kind of a political Christendom. And Charlemagne very deliberately took Augustine's City of God as a model for his, he understood it to refer to his empire, and he took it as a model. And with this term, Holy Roman Empire, and taking City of God, he was recalling this past stability, the Pax Romana that had spread itself across, that's Islam will spread itself across, there we go, this huge area. No, actually, the whole empire carried all of that. And he wants to identify with that, but as Christian, as this is the coming of the kingdom of God, actually, is the way he talks about it. Now, it's never true politically. He never actually has this area, this whole area, nor does he ever, nor does he ever manage to make it all Christian in the way he wants to. But that imaginative power comes to dominate the medieval period. And it has its roots here. And what Charlemagne does is continue to reshape, or Charlemagne and those around him, continue to reshape faith as an imperial religion. And we see it now in top-down missions, very, very conscious use of the Old Testament as a model. So the kind of theocracy that is envisaged in the Old Testament teachings about Israel, again, it never actually happened, but the theory behind the Old Testament kingship models is taken over and applied to the Holy Roman Empire. Huge shift in the self-understanding of the church from the early 300s through to 800, when we're talking 500 years, but huge shift in self-perception, self-understanding, very, very tiny shift for imperial religion. I mean, all imperial religion has done is swap one form of one name of God for another. And what it's the same model that religion is there to sustain, protect, enable the community and the political community to flourish. And it's there as a foundation for royal power. That's kind of how it's understood. So royal power depends on the Pope, or depends on the blessing of the God's blessing of the emperor. So he has his power by virtue of God's gift of it. And therefore, God is, as it were, the emperor is the representative of God politically and in terms of power. Say just a little bit about the East. In 527, when Justinian is drawing up his code, what he's wanting to do is to make the empire whole again, to try and bring back the West and East together. He also is drawing on the image of the kingdom of God and trying to unite, so that's too far on yet, trying to unite church and state. He works very clearly with the idea that God gave two great blessings to humanity, and this is what he says: God gave two great blessings to humanity, priest and emperor. God is the ultimate source of salvation, and that is mediated through the priest. God is the ultimate source of law, and that is mediated through the emperor. And the emperors in the East are crowned in the churches from 602, so from earlier than Charlemagne. And we've got this also going on, and this has much more impact in the East than it has in the West, which is the rise of Islam. So Islam's beginning in around 610. In 634, there is a fight in around Constantinople, Byzantium, and the emperor wins. Byzantine emperor wins, but you can see from the colours here, the empire, from there to there. So in 628, the Byzantine Empire, which is the Christian empire, covers all of that purple area. And by 733, it's a much smaller area. And Islam has spread. Islam here is green. So the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, has really narrowed in, drawn in, as Islam has swept through. 638, Muslims took Jerusalem. And we'll touch on the Crusades in another session. But so you can see here's Jerusalem here. So the loss of the holy places was a huge distress through the whole of not just the Eastern Empire, but through the Western Empire as well. By 711, the whole of, if you remember when we talked about Augustine and Tertullian and so on, all of this area, lost my cursor again, all of this area which had been Christian, so Alexandria, where you had the other great centre in Eastern Christianity, Carthage, down Tunis, where Augustine was. So all of this area, which was hugely Christian, has now become Muslim. And by 730, actually, they moved up into France. And then defeated it, as I said, defeated at Tours by Charles Martel. You can see why the bishop in Rome was so happy with what Charles Martel did, because the whole threat to Western Europe really was stopped at that point. But the Eastern Empire has, the Eastern Empire has really withdrawn into a much, much smaller area. And then gets itself in 726. So just as we're coming up to Martel beating the Muslim armies at Tours, the Eastern Church and the Empire gets itself torn apart by the iconoclastic struggle, which is to do with whether you can have images in church or not. The emperor is involved, the empress is involved, and there's a very it's a very deep-seated fight that does actually lead to riots and the destruction of images and the keeping of images and the shutting out of people who don't want images. And if you go into Eastern Orthodox churches now, you see the iconostasis and the beauty of the icons and the part that the icons play in the spirituality. And that's what was being struggled for in the iconoclastic struggle. very different. It's actually quite a different. So it's possible to see links between that and some things that happen in the Reformation in the West, when you've got the destruction of images and statues. But the kind of spirituality around the icons is actually quite different. So the struggle that happens in the iconoclastic struggle is something quite different. It's more to do with modes of prayer. What does prayer mean? Than are we allowed to have pictures in church? It's a different kind of theological debate that's going on. But what we've got here, what we're ending up with now, is really two forms of Christendom in the East and the West, two forms of Christian society. In the East, the emperor is in charge, the emperor is crowned in churches, but the emperor is playing a decisive role in the life of the church. So it's the emperor who calls the councils, it's the emperor who determines actually the outcome of most of the councils. The emperor is crowned in the church because the emperor has an authority within the church that is owned and celebrated in the coronation. And this remains true. If you visit the cathedral in Moscow, there are two thrones there for the emperor. Now, there isn't an emperor, but because of course the emperor was lost at the Tsar, was lost at the revolution, but there's still a sense of identifying the person who fills that role has a place in the church, and the church, where in Western cathedrals you will find a bishop's chair, in the Eastern cathedral there's the throne for the emperor. And this, I mean, it goes back to something I was saying very early on. This is one of the issues around with Putin. This is one of the things that's going on, and part of what this theology has led to is what's known as canonical territory. So that which is a political entity has a religious identity, and you only need one church in that area because you only have one ruler, and therefore you only have one church. And that's part of what is happening. Does Ukraine belong to Russian canonical territory? Is part of the fight that's going on. In the West, the balance shifts, and it does keep shifting all the way through the medieval period. But the sense is that it's the Pope, Bishop of Rome, that makes the emperor. So the emperor cannot be emperor unless the Pope crowns him. So the authority actually remains very much the Pope, and the Pope is theologically in charge. And it's see it operating in a variety of ways. But you've when we talked about Augustine, we talked about Ambrose, and Ambrose was one who exemplified what becomes the norm of the period we're getting to, in that the excuse me, he faced down the emperor, who that there had been an incident of anti-Semitism, and the emperor wanted to punish those who had provoked it, and Ambrose was not having any of this, because he did not want the emperor to be taking the side of those who he understood to be haters of Christians. Now we're pre-Constantine here, so the church is still unstable. But what I beg your pardon, we're not pre-Constantine at all. But we're pre Theodosius. We're pre the absolute identity of Christian in Rome. Ambrose refused to allow the emperor to receive communion until he had made public penance. That is the sort of one of the models, and feeds into this model in the West, that the Pope has the power over the emperor. Now, there's struggles all the way through, and we'll come across them as we go through, because no emperor or no ruler wants to feel he's under anybody else's power. But that's the model as which is very different from the Eastern model. And that's, again, another of these differences that is driving the two parts of the church apart. So the separation of East and West is linguistic. It's Latin versus Greek. It's ecclesiological. It's the power of Rome as opposed to the power of Constantinople and Alexandria. And the term that's used in the East is autocephalous. So there are different, self-headed, rather than one head covering the whole of the area, which is what is happening with Rome. You've got the Bishop of Rome is now, by the time we're talking about now, the Pope is now the supreme head over bishops below him, and so on. The Eastern churches are what they call autocephalous. So Constantinople, Nicaea, Jerusalem, actually, when it was still held by the Christians, and Alexandria, those bishops are all of an equal position. So they are understood to work together and to be head of their own area, and their own areas are independent in that sense. There are differences in liturgy, very, very significant differences in liturgy, and there are differences in theology, particularly around the excuse me, the nature of the Spirit, the relationship of the Spirit to the Father and the Son, and who has the right to draw up the creed. So all of these differences are going on, and these two churches really have become quite separate now. And Western Christendom, which is what we're going to concentrate on in the next few sessions, now marked by an identity that says faith is not a question of choice. Faith is, you're born in this area, you are Christian. It is a political, social necessity. So that has changed baptism. Baptism is, again, it's not a matter of choice. Baptism is now normally of those who are infants. And it also is not preceded by instruction. If you remember, in the early days, we saw it with Augustine, we saw it with some others, people became what they call catechumens, those who were learners, and they would spend 3, 6, 9 months, sometimes longer, learning both theology and church history, but also church practice and what did it mean to live as a Christian. So they were expected to visit the poor and visit the prisons and give alms and so on, and they needed to demonstrate they were doing that. All of that has gone now. If you're baptizing infants, the idea is the instruction is lifelong, because you're all in church anyway, so everyone's just being taught. If you live in this society, you are living as a Christian. So the term conversion is still used, but it is now used to refer to becoming a monk. We will talk about monasticism in the next session. So the idea of religious conversion still exists, but it's not conversion from not being Christian to being Christian. It's conversion from being a secular Christian to being, oh dear, excuse me, being a monastic Christian. Discipleship, instead of being something that might put you outside citizenship or put you at odds with the social and political powers around you, is now identified with citizenship. No longer looking for the coming of the kingdom, because the kingdom's arrived. Clovis through to Charlemagne were quite clear about that. And therefore the kingdom is now, that which is to come is now looked at as being beyond death. So there is a growing sense, and again, we will look at this in much more detail next time, looking at purgatory and monasticism next time, but there's a growing sense of what really matters is what happens after death, because, it's all sorted out, and that's what we've got Christendom, it's all here, but what really matters is what happens after death. And therefore, afterlife and salvation in terms of the afterlife becomes the main theme. The whole point is to be saved from this world. The church is territorial. So you no longer get, there's writings in the 2nd century, Hippolytus, who writes about Christians who belong to all nations and none. And his argument is that there are Christians in every country that he knows of, but they don't identify primarily with their nation or their race. They identify primarily as Christians. That's no longer a language that makes sense. there's now Christendom, and it's set over against Islam. So you're Christian or you're Muslim, or there's the Jews, but they're normally that just keep things slightly on edge. The church is territorial, and what the faith is about keeping order, and this is the identification with the Pax Romana. This idea that what the church is good for, what faith is good for, is keeping a cohesive society rather than challenging an unjust society. Now, that's not overwhelming. It's not the only truth that's around. And again, as we go through the medieval period, we'll see there were those who were questioning injustice and challenging it in the name of the gospel. But it's also, you've got this other strand now that the faith is identified with the social powers and the status quo. And I think one of the hugest shifts, and we saw it with Constantine, and we see it again with Clovis, is that we move from the cross being the sign of blessing to the cross being a military symbol. So the cross is now being used to mark those who are going into battle. And it's being taken into battle as a symbol of God is with us and we are therefore going to win. And from a community which prior to Constantine, Christians did not join the army. They were not, the army didn't want them because they wouldn't take they wouldn't make the oaths to the gods that were required. But also Christians didn't join the army because Christians didn't kill. And by the time we get to Charlemagne, you now have the army is used to impose the faith. You see, there's a huge move in what we call Christendom, and it just takes the church in a very different direction, and one I think that people couldn't have imagined. If you talk to people, the generation before Constantine, and describe the generation of Charlemagne, I don't think it would make sense, because it makes sense when you trace the story and you can see how it happens, but I don't think it was anybody could have dreamt of it happening. So I'm going to suggest we've actually got, we have not talked too much again. I'm going to give us 10 minutes. It's just about 1:45 now. 10 minutes to go. No, is Christendom a gift or a curse? I mean, it's the historical fact, and I will argue as we come towards the end of this course that we are certainly in the disintegration of Christendom, if not actually post-Christendom in Western Europe. But we still live with the history, and therefore the church identity that has been shaped by the 1,000, 1,200 years of Christendom. Good or bad thing? Discuss. I'm going to